Rain pounded against Officer James Miller's patrol car window as lightning illuminated a Mercedes cutting through the darkness ahead. Something about the driver's silhouette triggered a familiar itch in his gut, the same one that had earned him an unofficial reputation in the department as a bloodhound with a perfect record of arrests. Miller killed his headlights and followed the black car, his pulse quickening as he radioed in the plates, his fingers already drumming with anticipation on his holster. The night shift had been quiet, too quiet for Miller's taste as he patrolled the affluent Oak Ridge neighborhood where expensive homes lined manicured streets, the kind of place where residents complained if they saw anyone who didn't fit their idea of belonging. Miller had worked this beat for 5 years now, and he prided himself on keeping the wrong element out of his territory. The Mercedes ahead was doing exactly the speed limit, which in Miller's experience meant the driver had something to hide. Thunder rolled overhead as Miller ran the plates through the system, his dashboard computer taking longer than usual to respond. The rain intensified, creating sheets of water across his windshield, but he maintained visual contact with the target vehicle, watching as it signaled perfectly for every turn. Miller knew these streets like the back of his hand, this particular road often used by drivers trying to avoid the main thoroughfare where more patrol cars lurked. The computer finally pinged back with the vehicle registration information registered to a Marcus, Washington, in the upscale River Heights area. Miller scoffed, knowing that neighborhood had recently seen an influx of new money residents, changing the traditional demographics of the historically exclusive enclave. His fellow officers had been discussing the changes in the break room, their tones carrying unspoken concerns about the shifting landscape of their jurisdiction. Static crackled over his radio as dispatch acknowledged his location check. Miller felt the familiar surge of adrenaline course through his veins as he flipped on his lights, the same rush he got every time he initiated what he called a quality stop, his personal code for providing that he shared with a select group of like-minded officers in the department. The Mercedes pulled over with textbook precision, another red flag in Miller's book, as his training had taught him that overly compliant behavior often masked guilty intentions. Miller adjusted his body camera, making sure it was positioned just slightly upward, a trick he had learned to obscure certain angles while still appearing to follow protocol. Reaching back, he checked his backup weapon, a small caliber pistol strapped to his ankle. Department regulation required it, but Miller had his own reasons for wanting the extra security, especially during night stops in this part of town. He had earned several commendations for weapons seizures during traffic stops, always seeming to find probable cause where other officers saw routine interactions. The rain drummed harder against the roof of his patrol car as Miller called in his stop location, providing dispatch with the bare minimum information required by protocol. He knew the closest backup unit was at least 10 minutes away, giving him plenty of time to conduct his investigation the way he preferred without the watchful eyes of other officers, particularly the newer ones who seemed obsessed with procedure and political correctness these days. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the Mercedes' sleek lines and dark-tinted windows. Miller could make out movement inside the vehicle. The driver appeared to be reaching for something in the glove compartment. Miller unclipped his holster, his heart rate elevated, but steady years of similar stops had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct told him this stop would add another compelling story to his growing collection of successful interventions. What the other officers called luck, Miller knew, was skilled observation and decisive action. A small crowd of residents had begun to gather on their front porches, drawn by the flashing lights that bounced off the wet pavement, creating an eerie blue and red light show in the falling rain. Miller paid them no mind. Experience had taught him that the residents of Oak Ridge would always support an officer keeping their streets safe. He took a deep breath, adjusted his raincoat, and stepped out of his patrol car into the stormy night, unaware that every step he took toward the Mercedes was leading him toward a confrontation that would shatter his world and change law enforcement forever. Captain Marcus Washington watched the patrol car, dusting him in his rearview mirror, his weathered hands clenching the steering wheel of his Mercedes. The irony once lost on him 20 years on the force, 3 commendations, and a captain's badge, yet here, he was again being hunted on the very streets he protected. The secret recording device he used for undercover operations was still running in his pocket, capturing every moment of what was about to become the department's biggest scandal. The night's successful drug bust operation at the marina still played fresh in his mind, where his team had seized over $2 million worth of cocaine. His plainclothes and civilian vehicle had been crucial to maintaining his cover as he supervised the operation from a distance. Now those same elements made him a target on his drive home through Oak Ridge, a neighborhood he had helped keep safe for over a decade, yet never felt truly welcome in. Washington glanced at his watch, noting it was just past midnight, as rain hammered against his windshield. The flash drive containing evidence from tonight's bust sat securely in his briefcase on the passenger seat, along with his service weapon and badge. He had deliberately followed every traffic rule, knowing from experience that certain officers in this precinct looked for any excuse to initiate what they called routine stops of vehicles driven by minorities, even expensive ones, perhaps especially expensive ones. The patrol car behind him had killed its headlights, a tactical approach Washington recognized from his own training days, but now viewed through a different lens. Had spent the last 6 months quietly gathering data on traffic stop patterns in this district after receiving numerous complaints from respected community members, including judges, doctors, and fellow officers, all sharing similar stories of harassment. The recording device in his pocket was department issued for undercover work, but tonight it served a different purpose. His phone lit up with a text from Lieutenant Chen in Internal Affairs. Their ongoing investigation into discriminatory policing practices had identified several officers of concern. Washington felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the patrol car number reflected in his side mirror. Officer James Miller, whose stop records showed an alarming pattern that had somehow slipped past department oversight for years. This moment had been inevitable. Washington realized, almost destiny calling up his 20 years of experience to stay calm as red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind him. The rain intensified as Washington pulled over using textbook precision, a habit ingrained from decades of training. He could see Miller in his mirror using an approach pattern that set off every warning bell in his veteran mind. The officer was moving as if approaching a high-risk stop, hand hovering near his weapon. Washington knew the next few moments would be crucial. He quietly activated his phone's video recording as backup to his pocket device, knowing that documentation would be essential for what was about to unfold. A quick glance around revealed several residents emerging from their homes. Despite the rain, their phones already raised to record the scene. Washington had seen this before, but usually from the other side of the badge. The gathering crowd would either be witnesses to another instance of profiling or perhaps something more significant, a chance to expose and change the systemic issues that had plagued the department for generations. His hand moved slowly toward his credentials as Miller approached, thoughts turning to his own son at the police academy, who would inherit whatever department they shaped today. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the scene in stark flashes as Washington watched Miller adjust his body camera, a subtle movement that years of Internal Affairs Review Board experience told him was deliberate to obscure the upcoming interaction. The captain had seen enough cases thrown out due to conveniently angled cameras or muted audio, but tonight would be different. Tonight, every second would be preserved from multiple angles. As the officer approached, Washington could see Miller's face in his mirror, the expression of anticipated triumph that would soon turn to something else entirely when he realized he had stopped the wrong person, or perhaps exactly the right one, to finally bring about change. The dashcam footage would later show Officer Miller approaching the Mercedes like a predator, his flashlight beam deliberately aimed to blind, while his other hand rested on his weapon. But what the camera couldn't capture was the moment of electric tension when Captain Washington slowly reached for his credentials. Miller's barked commands suddenly drowned out by approaching sirens and the gathering crowd of witnesses, their cell phones creating a constellation of recording lights in the darkness. License and registration Now Miller shouted over the pounding rain, his voice carrying that edge of authority he had perfected over years of traffic stops, the same tone that had earned him quiet praise from certain colleagues and multiple civilian complaints that somehow never stuck. Miller watched the driver's hands carefully, noting their deliberate slowness, which he immediately interpreted as defiance rather than compliance. Thunder roared overhead as if nature itself was providing a soundtrack to the mounting tension. Captain Washington maintained his measured movements. Decades of experience had taught him that sudden gestures in these situations could turn deadly in seconds. He could feel the weight of his badge in his breast pocket, but reaching for it too quickly could escalate the situation. His secret recording device captured Miller's increasingly aggressive commands, the officer's voice betraying an excitement that Washington had heard before in officers who were looking for confrontation rather than compliance. The gathering crowd had swelled to nearly 30 people, now their phones raised like digital witnesses. Some were streaming live to social media, while others whispered among themselves, recognizing Captain Washington from community outreach programs. Several residents had already dialed 911, reporting what they perceived as harassment, their calls adding to the approaching sirens that echoed through the rainy night. Miller seemed oblivious to the audience, his tunnel vision focused entirely on the Mercedes and its driver. "I said hands where I can see them," Miller bellowed, taking an aggressive step forward, his boots splashing in the growing puddles that reflected the patrol car's swirling lights. Washington recognized the tactical approach, designed to establish dominance, but also knew it violated at least 3 department protocols for routine traffic stops. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his voice calm and professional, as he began to identify himself as law enforcement, only to be cut off by Miller, who was now calling for backup, claiming a suspicious subject and possible weapon. The rain intensified as Washington caught glimpses of social media notifications lighting up his phone on the passenger seat. Live streams of the incident were already going viral, drawing comments from fellow officers watching in real time, some recognizing their captain, others urgently calling dispatch to intervene. Miller remained unaware that his actions were being broadcast across multiple platforms. His next moves would be scrutinized by thousands of viewers, including the police chief, who had just been alerted to the situation. "Get out of the vehicle now," Miller demanded, his hand now fully gripping his weapon, the situation teetering on a knife edge. Washington could see teenagers in the crowd, their phones steady despite the rain capturing every moment, their young faces showing a mix of fear and anger at witnessing what appeared to be another incident of racial profiling in their neighborhood. An elderly couple stood on their porch, the woman already on the phone with a local news station, while her husband, a retired judge, watched with growing concern. Backup units screamed around the corner, their sirens piercing the night as Miller reached for the Mercedes door handle without waiting for compliance. His actions, now completely outside protocol, Washington remained still, knowing that any movement could give the agitated officer an excuse. The recording device in his pocket captured the sound of multiple car doors slamming as other officers arrived on scene, their flashlight beams cutting through the rain, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. As the confrontation reached its critical moment, time seemed to slow as Miller yanked the car door open, his actions becoming more aggressive with the arrival of what he assumed would be supporting officers. But the approaching footsteps belonged to Sergeant Rodriguez, Miller's direct supervisor, who had recognized the Mercedes and its driver from the live stream. The next few seconds would be replayed countless times in training sessions across the country as Miller suddenly realized the magnitude of his mistake, but pride and adrenaline pushed him forward into actions that would change not only his career but the entire department forever. The courthouse buzzed like a disturbed hornet's nest as Internal Affairs Detective Sarah Chen projected the devastating statistics onto the screen behind her. 78 racial profiling complaints against Officer Miller in 18 months, 0 investigations, 0 consequences. But tonight was different because this time Miller had stopped the wrong man, and the evidence was damning enough to shake the entire department to its foundation. Detective Chen clicked through to the next slide, her laser pointer, highlighting a map of Oak Ridge showing red dots representing Miller's traffic stops over the past year. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Clusters of dots in areas where minority residents lived or frequently drove through, while wealthy white neighborhoods showed almost no stops at all. In the gallery, journalists scribbled furiously in their notepads, while civil rights attorneys leaned forward studying every detail with predatory intensity. The evidence continued to mount as Chen methodically presented her findings, text messages between Miller and other officers revealing a scoring system they had developed for profiling stops, body camera footage showing dramatically different treatment of drivers based on race, dash cam videos revealing a pattern of escalation during stops involving minorities. The courtroom remained silent, except for the occasional gasp as particularly damning evidence appeared on screen. Miller sat at the defense table, his once pristine uniform now feeling like a costume. His attorneys fidgeted uncomfortably as Chen played audio recordings from his patrol car, catching casual conversations with fellow officers, using racial slurs, and discussing tactics to provoke confrontations. What made the evidence particularly powerful was how it had been gathered, not through a planned investigation, but because Captain Washington had been wearing his standard issue undercover recording device during the stop, capturing every word, every action, every violation of department policy. The judge leaned forward as Chen presented financial records showing how Miller and several other officers had benefited from asset seizures during these targeted stops, their performance bonuses correlating directly with stops in certain neighborhoods. Photos appeared on screen showing expensive purchases, boats, vacation homes, and luxury cars, all acquired on a police officer's salary. The implications of systemic corruption reaching far beyond simple racial bias. Lieutenant Rodriguez took the stand, next describing how he had witnessed the final confrontation after receiving alerts about the live streams, his testimony particularly powerful as he described arriving to find Miller aggressive and escalating despite clearly seeing Captain Washington's badge. The lieutenant detailed how he had been collecting his own evidence about problematic officers but had faced resistance from within the department when trying to address these issues. Social media footage from that rainy night played on the courtroom screens, showing multiple angles of the confrontation, the growing crowd of witnesses, their phones raised, capturing every moment, the arrival of backup units, and most damaging, Miller's continued aggression. Even after Washington was clearly identified as a senior officer, the footage had gone viral, reaching millions of views and sparking protests nationwide demanding police reform. Chen methodically connected the dots, revealing how Miller and his unofficial network of like-minded officers had managed to avoid scrutiny for years by carefully wording their reports, manipulating body camera footage, and intimidating complainants into withdrawing their allegations. The scope of the corruption becoming clear as financial records, phone logs, and patrol data painted a picture of organized, discriminatory policing. The courtroom grew tense as Chen presented her final piece of evidence, a recorded conversation between Miller and another officer discussing how to handle Captain Washington's complaint, the casual racism and assumption of departmental protection, revealing a culture of impunity that had festered unchecked for years in the gallery. Civil rights leaders exchanged knowing glances, while police union representatives whispered urgently with their lawyers, the implications of this case reaching far beyond one officer's actions to expose a systemic failure of oversight and accountability. As Chen concluded her presentation, the weight of evidence hung heavy in the air like storm clouds, promising a deluge of change. Miller stared straight ahead, his face unreadable, as the judge called for a brief recess. But everyone in the courtroom knew this was more than a simple disciplinary hearing. It was a moment that would force the entire law enforcement community to confront its darkest shadows and either emerge reformed or be forever tainted by its failure to address the cancer growing within its ranks. You could hear a pin drop in the courtroom as security footage revealed Officer Miller's previous stops playing in devastating sequence. But the real bombshell came when Captain Washington approached the stand, his testimony beginning not with accusations but with a childhood memory of his father, another cop, being pulled over again and again until one day he never came home from a routine traffic stop. The gallery erupted in shocked whispers as Washington connected decades of institutional bias to this single moment. Captain Washington shifted in the witness chair, his voice steady and measured as he recounted how his father's death had driven him to join the force 20 years ago, determined to change the system from within. He described watching generation after generation of young officers, starting with good intentions, only to be slowly corrupted by an unofficial culture that rewarded aggressive profiling and discriminatory practices. His words carried extra weight as he detailed his own journey through the ranks, facing resistance and subtle sabotage at every promotion. The courtroom remained transfixed as Washington pulled out a small leather notebook, worn with age, explaining it had belonged to his father, containing detailed records of every stop, every interaction, every subtle indication of systemic racism he had encountered as one of the department's first black officers. Washington described how he had continued his father's documentation through his own career, creating a 25-year record of departmental bias that paralleled the current investigation into Miller. Evidence photos flashed across the screen showing Washington's own experiences, identical traffic stops, hostile responses from fellow officers, and subtle retaliations when he tried to report misconduct. But rather than anger, his testimony carried a tone of understanding, acknowledging how department culture could shape and corrupt officers who might have started their careers with noble intentions. His eyes met Miller's across the courtroom as he described recognizing in the younger officer the same patterns he had witnessed throughout his career. Washington revealed how he had been working with internal affairs for months before the incident, secretly documenting the pattern of profiling and building a case that could force departmental change. He explained how the night of his stop had not been random, but rather an inevitable collision between old prejudices and new accountability. His recording device had been running not just by chance, but because he had learned through bitter experience that documentation was the only defense against systemic denial. The gallery listened in stunned silence as Washington described the moment Miller approached his car that rainy night, explaining how he had recognized in the officer's aggressive stance and tone the same dangerous escalation that had preceded his father's final traffic stop. He detailed how decades of experience had taught him to remain calm, even as Miller violated protocol after protocol. His testimony painting a picture not of a single bad officer, but of a system that created and protected such behavior. Tears appeared in the eyes of several jurors as Washington shared photographs of his father in uniform standing proud at his graduation from the police academy, alongside news clippings of his death ruled justified despite conflicting witness statements. He connected that historic incident to the present, showing how little had changed in the decades between his father's lost traffic stop and his own encounter with Miller, his testimony transforming the trial from a simple disciplinary hearing into a historic reckoning with law enforcement culture. Washington concluded by pulling out his own badge, placing it on the witness stand beside his father's tarnished shield. He spoke about his vision for the department, not as an adversary, but as someone who had dedicated his life to the promise of protect and serve. He described a future where officers like Miller could become part of a solution rather than perpetuating the problem, his words resonating through the courtroom as he offered a path forward that acknowledged past wrongs while creating opportunity for genuine change. The impact of Washington's testimony rippled through the courtroom as he stepped down from the stand. His narrative had transformed the proceedings from a simple case of officer misconduct into a powerful indictment of systemic failure and a compelling call for institutional reform. Even Miller seemed affected, his usual defensive posture softening as he confronted the legacy of bias he had unknowingly inherited and perpetuated in the gallery. Veteran officers sat in uncomfortable silence as they recognized their own practices in the patterns Washington had exposed, while younger officers exchanged glances, realizing they stood at a crossroads between perpetuating the past or forging a new future. Officer Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat as his own bodycam footage played, revealing his unconscious muttering of racial slurs. But the real shock came when the prosecution revealed Miller's text messages to fellow officers, bragging about his targeting techniques, the defense attorney's face turned ashen as their carefully constructed case of reasonable suspicion began crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. Sweat beaded on Miller's forehead as the prosecution methodically displayed his patrol history map, showing how he had systematically avoided wealthy white neighborhoods while aggressively patrolling areas with minority residents. The data stretched back years, revealing a pattern so obvious it seemed impossible that no one had noticed, or perhaps more disturbingly, that those who noticed had chosen to remain silent. The young officer found himself unable to meet the eyes of his fellow officers in the gallery, many of whom had once praised his proactive policing style. The courtroom screens displayed a series of text messages between Miller and a group chat called Blue Line Warriors, messages joking about quota systems, sharing tips on probable cause fabrication, and celebrating particularly aggressive stops of minority drivers. Miller watched as his own words scrolled past each message, accompanied by timestamps, location data, and metadata that proved their authenticity, his carefully maintained image of professional law enforcement crumbling with each revelation. Detective Chen approached the evidence table holding Miller's personal phone records, showing calls made to other officers immediately after controversial stops, coordinating stories, manipulating reports, and discussing ways to discourage civilian complaints. The systematic nature of the corruption became clear as Chen demonstrated how these calls corresponded with officially filed reports that consistently cleared officers of wrongdoing despite witness statements to the contrary. Miller felt the weight of Captain Washington's gaze from across the courtroom as security footage showed their confrontation from multiple angles, the rainfall visible in the patrol car lights. As Miller approached the Mercedes with textbook profiling technique, the recording captured his dismissive tone when Washington attempted to identify himself as a fellow officer, and most damaging, the clear escalation of aggression. After Washington displayed his badge, the footage revealed a truth Miller had never been forced to confront about his own actions. The prosecution played audio from Miller's patrol car, recorded during routine conversations with his partner's casual racism, peppered through discussions of traffic stops, arrest quotas, and asset seizures. The recordings spanning months revealed how deeply ingrained these attitudes had become. Miller found himself wincing at his own laughter at jokes he had once found harmless, his eyes drawn to the horrified expressions of young cadets in the gallery who had once looked up to him as a model officer. Witness after witness took the stand describing encounters with Miller, each story following a similar pattern of escalation, intimidation, and harassment. Local business owners testified about watching Miller target minority customers, church leaders spoke about congregants afraid to drive to Sunday services, teachers described students missing school because their parents feared being stopped. The human cost of Miller's actions becoming devastatingly clear as the testimony continued. The defense team's attempts to justify Miller's actions grew increasingly desperate as they tried to paint him as a proactive officer working dangerous neighborhoods, their arguments falling flat against a mountain of statistical evidence showing how his stops disproportionately targeted minorities, regardless of crime rates or neighborhood demographics. Miller watched his career dissolving before his eyes as the prosecution systematically dismantled every explanation, every justification, every excuse he had ever used. As the day wore on, Miller found his thoughts returning to Captain Washington's testimony about his father, watching the older officer's composed demeanor as he shared his painful history. Miller began to recognize patterns in his own behavior that mirrored the systemic issues Washington had described. The realization of his role in perpetuating this cycle hitting him with unexpected force as he sat surrounded by evidence of his own prejudice. The final blow came when the prosecution played footage from Miller's police academy graduation, showing his passionate speech about protecting and serving all citizens equally. The stark contrast between those idealistic words and his documented actions created a silence in the courtroom that seemed to last forever. Miller sat motionless as his younger self spoke about justice and equality on the screen. Behind him, the weight of his transformation from idealistic rookie to profiling veteran visible in the slump of his shoulders. while in the gallery Captain Washington nodded slightly, a gesture of recognition. For the moment of self-awareness he saw crossing the younger officer's face. The tension in the courtroom could be cut with a knife as Judge Gloria Martinez leaned forward, her eyes scanning both men before delivering an unprecedented ruling. Instead of jail time, Officer Miller would be sentenced to work under Captain Washington in a groundbreaking program. The twist no one saw coming was that Washington had actually requested this outcome, having recognized in Miller's behavior the same prejudices he had once helped his own father overcome. Judge Martinez removed her reading glasses, her voice carrying authority, as she detailed the unique conditions of her ruling. Miller would be required to complete 2,000 hours of supervised duty under Captain Washington's direct command in a newly created Community Accountability Division. The program would focus on identifying and addressing systemic bias in police procedures while developing new training protocols for officers across the department. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom as the innovative sentence was revealed. The judge continued, explaining how the division would be granted unprecedented access to departmental records, body camera footage, and complaint histories. The findings would be reported directly to a civilian oversight committee comprised of community leaders, civil rights attorneys, and law enforcement reform experts. Miller would be required to participate in conducting statistical analysis of traffic stops, reviewing body camera footage for bias indicators, and developing new training materials based on his own experiences and transformation. Washington sat quietly as the judge outlined his role as both supervisor and mentor, responsible for guiding Miller's rehabilitation while using their shared experiences to create meaningful change in department culture. The program would include regular public forums where both men would share their perspectives on profiling and bias with fellow officers, community members, and police academy cadets, their story becoming a living case study in recognition and reform of systemic racism. The innovative sentence drew immediate reaction from all corners of the courtroom. Civil rights attorneys huddled together discussing precedent, police union representatives frantically typed on their phones, while journalists rushed from the room to file breaking news stories about this unconventional approach to addressing police misconduct. Miller himself sat stunned as the judge detailed how his body camera footage, text messages, and patrol records would become teaching tools in the new program. Judge Martinez addressed the broader implications, explaining how the Community Accountability Division would serve as a pilot program for departments nationwide. Their findings and methodologies would be shared with police academies across the country, creating a new standard for addressing bias in law enforcement. She emphasized how this approach focused on transformation rather than punishment, using past mistakes as stepping stones toward meaningful reform. The ruling included strict oversight measures. Regular progress reports would be required from both Washington and Miller's. Psychological evaluations would track changes in implicit bias metrics, and body cameras would record all their interactions during the program. Civilian observers would be permitted to attend their training sessions, and community feedback would be actively solicited and incorporated into their developing methodologies. Washington nodded slowly as the judge outlined his authority to recommend further disciplinary action if Miller failed to engage meaningfully with the program, but her words carried hope rather than threat, emphasizing the opportunity for both men to create lasting change in law enforcement culture. The sentence would require them to document their journey, publishing regular reports that would become required reading at police academies and law enforcement conferences nationwide. The gallery watched in amazement as the judge detailed how the program would expand beyond traffic stops to address racial bias in all aspects of policing, from suspect descriptions to use of force decisions. Miller and Washington would be required to develop new protocols for officer training, focusing on recognition and elimination of implicit bias, their shared experiences forming the foundation for a new approach to police reform. Judge Martinez concluded by addressing both men directly, challenging them to transform their confrontation into collaboration, their conflict into constructive change, emphasizing how their unique perspectives could help bridge the gap between law enforcement and minority communities. She spoke about the historic opportunity they had been given to affect real change in police culture, their story potentially becoming a catalyst for nationwide reform. The courtroom remained silent as the judge finished speaking, the weight of her innovative ruling settling over the assembled crowd. Miller glanced at Washington, their eyes meeting briefly across the courtroom, both men understanding that this sentence represented not just their own futures but the potential transformation of American law enforcement. Captain Washington stood straight and proud, while Miller, for the first time since the trial began, lifted his head, accepting the challenge and responsibility that lay before them as the judge gavelled the session to a close, marking the beginning of their unprecedented journey toward reform. Over the next year, Miller and Washington worked together, transforming their confrontation into a powerful teaching tool. They traveled to police academies, sharing their story and implementing new training protocols. Their partnership became a symbol of how confronting racism head on could lead to meaningful change. What started as a forced collaboration slowly evolved into a genuine mission to reform law enforcement from within. The Community Accountability Division headquarters buzzed with activity as Miller and Washington reviewed body camera footage from recent traffic stops across the department, their office walls covered with statistics charts and demographic data tracking changes in officer behavior. Miller, who once viewed such oversight as a threat to proper policing, now pointed out subtle signs of bias in officer interactions, his own past experiences giving him unique insight into the mindset they were working to change. Washington watched with quiet satisfaction as Miller led a training session for new recruits. The younger officer, who had once profiled minorities, now passionately explained how unconscious bias could corrupt good officers. His presentation included his own body camera footage from that rainy night, showing recruits how quickly prejudice could escalate a routine stop into a potentially deadly confrontation. The cadets sat transfixed as Miller openly shared his journey from pride to shame to redemption. Their program gained national attention as departments across the country began reporting significant drops in racial profiling complaints after implementing their training protocols. Miller and Washington found themselves speaking at law enforcement conferences, their story resonating with officers who recognized their own biases in Miller's past behavior. Together, they developed a comprehensive screening system for identifying potential bias in officer candidates by creating support systems for those struggling with ingrained prejudices. The transformation became personal as Miller spent time in the communities he had once terrorized. Washington arranged meetings with families who'd been affected by aggressive policing, watching as Miller listened to their stories with growing understanding. The officer who once saw only suspects now saw fathers, mothers, children, and fellow citizens, his evolution documented in the department's new training videos that would be used to teach future generations of officers. Local community leaders who had initially opposed Miller's rehabilitation now became strong supporters, watching as he worked tirelessly to make amends. Washington guided these interactions, ensuring that community feedback directly shaped their evolving protocols. Together, they established regular town hall meetings where officers and residents could openly discuss concerns and solutions, creating a model for community policing that began attracting attention from civil rights organizations nationwide. Their partnership faced challenges as some officers resisted the new accountability measures, viewing Miller as a traitor to the thin blue line, while community activists questioned the sincerity of his change. Washington steadfastly defended their work, showing how statistical evidence proved the effectiveness of their approach. Traffic stop data revealed a dramatic shift in department behavior as more officers underwent their training. Racial disparities in stops such as arrests dropped significantly. Miller found himself counseling other officers who recognized their own biases. His office became a safe space for those struggling to adapt to new expectations. His journey from resistance to acceptance, helping others navigate their own transformations. Washington observed these sessions, noting how Miller's unique perspective reached officers in ways that traditional sensitivity training never could. The combined experiences creating a powerful testament to the possibility of genuine change. The media followed their progress closely as their pilot program expanded to neighboring departments. News cameras captured Miller and Washington working side by side reviewing cases, developing training materials, and meeting with community groups. Their obvious rapport and shared commitment to reform inspiring departments nationwide to re examine their own practices and policies regarding bias and accountability. Their most powerful moments came during joint presentations where they alternated perspectives, describing the same incident, Washington sharing the fear and frustration of being profiled, while Miller exposed the flawed thinking that had driven his actions. Their honest dialogue creating breakthrough moments for officers who had never confronted their own biases so directly. The impact of their partnership extending far beyond their own department to influence law enforcement culture across the country. 1 year after the judge's innovative ruling, Miller and Washington stood together at a national police reform conference, their presentation showing concrete evidence of reduced bias incidents, improved community relations, and increased trust in law enforcement. Their story had evolved from a potential tragedy into a blueprint for institutional change. As they prepared to share their latest findings, Miller caught Washington's eye, both men sharing a moment of silent acknowledgement for how far they had come and how much work still lay ahead in their mission to transform American policing. Headlines across the country exploded as the unlikely duo testified before Congress, their story becoming a catalyst for police reform nationwide. But the real miracle happened in their own precinct, where traffic stop complaints dropped by 90% after their training program went into effect. The final twist came when Officer Miller received the department's new Transformation Award, presented by none other than Captain Washington's father, who had returned to the force inspired by the changes his son had helped create. The congressional hearing room fell silent as Miller and Washington presented their 2 year data analysis, showing dramatic reductions in racially motivated stops across departments that had implemented their protocols. Miller now spoke with the authority of experience as he detailed how their program had identified and addressed systemic bias in over 50 police departments. Nationwide photographs displayed behind them showed diverse groups of officers and community members working together in trust-building initiatives that would have seemed impossible just years before. Washington watched with pride as Miller fielded questions from skeptical senators, explaining how their accountability measures had actually improved officer safety by building community trust. Their presentation included video testimonials from officers who had initially resisted change but now championed their methods. Body camera footage comparing before and after traffic stops demonstrated the stark difference in approach and outcome as officers learned to recognize and overcome their unconscious biases. The most powerful moment came when Miller shared newly uncovered footage from the night of his confrontation with Washington, this time analyzed through the lens of their training program. He broke down his own actions moment by moment, identifying trigger points where bias had overwhelmed training. The packed hearing room watched transfixed as Miller explained how their program now used this footage to help officers recognize similar moments in their own behavior, creating opportunities for intervention before bias could escalate into confrontation. Back at their precinct, the changes were evident in ways big and small. Officers now regularly attended community events, not as security, but as participants. Local residents shared positive interactions on social media, where complaints had once dominated the feed. Washington and Miller had created a mentorship program pairing veteran officers with community leaders, ensuring that every officer understood the human impact of their actions. Their success attracted attention from police departments worldwide seeking to replicate their results. The transformation reached beyond just traffic stops, affecting every aspect of police work. Their protocols for handling domestic calls, mental health crisis, and youth interactions showed similar improvements in outcomes. Their data proving that removing racial bias from policing not only protected minority communities but made police work safer and more effective for everyone involved. They had effectively demonstrated that good policing and equal treatment were not opposing forces but essential partners. Miller found himself mentoring young officers, many drawn to law enforcement by his and Washington's story. Their experiences now required reading at police academies across the nation, The officer who had once embodied the problem of systemic racism had become living proof that change was possible. His journey from prejudice to awareness, inspiring a new generation of officers committed to equality and justice. Their training center became a model facility hosting observers from departments worldwide eager to implement their methods. Washington received national recognition for his role in transforming potential tragedy into triumph. But he always redirected praise to the broader movement their work had sparked. Their program had expanded beyond traffic stops to address racial bias in hiring, promotion, and leadership development, creating pathways for minority officers to advance while ensuring all officers received comprehensive bias recognition training. The results showed in the changing face of law enforcement leadership nationwide. The final chapter of their story unfolded at a ceremony marking the third anniversary of their fateful encounter. Miller and Washington stood together as the department unveiled a new training facility named in honor of Washington's father. The building would house their expanding program and serve as a national center for bias prevention and community policing research. Their work had transformed a moment of confrontation into a legacy of positive change that would influence law enforcement for generations. As Miller pinned on his new captain's bars, Washington beside him as his sponsor, both men reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Their story had become more than just a case study in police reform. It represented hope that even the deepest divisions could be bridged through understanding and commitment to change. As they faced the assembled crowd of officers, community leaders, and media, they shared a knowing look, their partnership having proved that transformation was possible not just for individuals but for institutions, and that the path to justice began with the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and the wisdom to learn from them.